Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Goals. This is a conversation about what you and I can do to help make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business by achieving 17 big goals. And we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. Now, countries around the world have agreed to work on the SDGs to make the world a better place by 2030. And the idea is to make sure that everyone, everywhere can live a good life without harming the planet. Now, that without harming the planet part, that's the sustainable part of sustainable development. Without the planet, we don't have a home. So the goals are really about keeping that home functioning. And so far, we've discussed development planning and Jamaica's own national plan. So today, I'm going to start, as always, by saying something I've been saying throughout the series, that at the end of the day, a national plan is just that. It's a plan for every Jamaican, as in every Jamaican national, every person. So we are the ones who live in our houses, we're the ones who live in our communities, so we all have to act. It's all about partnership, which, as it turns out, is a topic for today. And to break it down today, my guest is Mr. Dennis Zulu. He's the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Jamaica, the Bahamas, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, and the Turks and Caicos Islands. They have a whole lot on your plate. And first I want to talk about, in simple language, the SDGs, which are 17 big goals. The key word is sustainable, which means what?
Well, sustainable means a lot of things, but I think for us, the Sustainable Development Goals are important because we're not talking about short term. We're talking long term here. And for us to be able to achieve what we set out to do, as member states, we are looking at interventions which will help the lives and the livelihoods of people for a very long period of time. Because you will notice that if you're working in development, a lot of interventions tend to be short term, medium term, and long term. Now, for us to improve the way we live, if it's eliminate poverty, for instance, improve education, improve health, we really need to be looking long term, because that's what we're looking for. Because the differences can all be made long term, and if we're going to guarantee good lives and good health and good education, it should be over a long period of time rather than a short period of time.
Very often with goals like this, people think of it from the perspective of the agency or organization that's proposing it. But as someone in my house, why should I be concerned about sustainable goals?
Well, because you're a direct beneficiary, one, and secondly, because you're also part and parcel of making them happen. So, for instance, if it's poverty, we have people living under poverty. You could be one of those who are living under the poverty datum line, so you're interested in moving on from poverty. And the government is interested in moving on from poverty. But that doesn't happen if you're passive. So you need to kind of have an active role and do your part to move away from poverty. So, for instance, it's not just about looking for a job, but also getting involved in some sort of economic activity. It could be farming. It could also be some cultural work. I know Jamaica is well renowned across the world for its cultural industry, tourism, music. We have a lot of craftspersons here, so they can get involved in that. So it's being active and being able to contribute to making your life better. So those are the two parts of it. But it's also knowing what the other goals mean, because they were not agreed in isolation. The 17 goals were agreed in as a whole big complement. And one thing that you don't hear very often is the fact that the 17 goals have 169 targets. So it's not just about the goal on poverty, but what does it mean to be out of poverty? You know, so the targets will articulate what a member state is supposed to be aiming for. If you look at goal number 8, for instance, which talks about decent work, some of the targets really look at how do you eliminate child labor. That's what. How do you have access to productive work? And here we need to be very, very, very careful, because work is, and sometimes you hear the term working poor, because some of the jobs people actually have don't necessarily pay sufficiently for them to move away from this poverty trap. So if it's jobs that are being created, there must be jobs that are what are called decent. They have rights, they pay a good wage, you have access to social protection or social insurance, but you're also able to negotiate with the employer what the job is all about. So within those 17 goals, we have 169 targets which we need to aim for. If it's education, for instance, the target should be how many children have access to school, how many children actually graduate, move from primary to secondary and thereafter to tertiary? How many children stay in school? And what's very important also, which goal number 5 talks about, is gender, because the gender dimension of sustainable development goals is very critical, because you find that usually females tend to be more vulnerable to all these things that we talk about. So how do we address issues of gender inequality? And those are all covered across all the 17 goals. But I think one important goal that's not talked about much is where you started from, goal number 17 on partnerships. Because this can't just happen. It's not just government's role to support and develop. We need to establish partnerships, and the UN that's why we're here, to establish partnerships with the government, but also with each one of the many Jamaicans living in this island. This is a collaborative effort, it's a coherent effort, and we need to work together. Private sector has to get actively involved, because the private sector accounts for a significant part of the economy, the productive part of the economy. So private sector is not removed from the whole movement of sustainable development, because they create the jobs, they create the goods and services that we rely on going forward.
So this is all about trying to plan together as a larger group, as understanding that it's about your home, but also about your community.
That's
and
very
everyone
true.
is a member of the community. So let's talk about planning from that perspective as well, because very often, again, national goals are seen like that, national goals, but people need to understand that there's a role they have for planning. Why is it important to, again, have a long-term plan?
Yeah, so long-term plan, and I think what we need to look at in terms of planning is how inclusive it is, because you talked about the community and the individual household. And the household comprises of individuals. So when you're planning, and I know Jamaica's Vision 2030, which is very clear in terms of what the priorities should be for Jamaica until we reach 2030. And it's not a coincidence that it's also 2030. That's when the SDGs actually elapse.
Yes.
So there was very good planning on the part of Jamaica in that respect. So we need to ensure that we leave no one behind, the common term, in terms of planning. How do we take into interest of the different segments of the economy, the different groups, persons with disability, women, young people, elderly people. So the planning really starts at the household level, the individual, and hopefully there's a mechanism which then facilitates the transmission of these priorities upstream up to the time when you have a document, Vision 2030, and the Vision 2030 document leaves no one behind. So it's an inclusive process of planning. And when you're dealing with development, you must make sure that each one of the interests of each individual unit in the planning process is then taken care of.
That's a lot to have to take into consideration.
Definitely.
So how then does the UN support countries in sort of adopting these goals and fashioning them in a way that benefits people in all facets of Jamaican life?
So first of all, when we are members, we are staff of the UN and agencies in Jamaica. There's currently 12 UN agencies and 7 that are operating in Jamaica, but from outside. And the first thing that we do is basically align our programs. In the case of Jamaica and the region in the Caribbean, of what we call the Multi-Country Sustainable Development Framework. This is a regional plan that has working with the governments in the region, taken or identified priorities. And these priorities then the UN has to link to. So we don't just come here and prescribe. We come here and listen and look at the priorities that the government has set, and then we try and tailor programs to meet or support those programs. So Vision 2030 for us makes it very easy to work as the UN, because the government is very clear as to what its plans are. The government plans are aligned to the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, and when you look at the very important component, which is monitoring and evaluation, because we need to monitor progress towards the SDGs. The government also has a very clear M&E framework, which then articulates what we need to be looking out for to ensure that we're on the right track. And talking about being on the right track, because obviously we know that at the moment, the SDGs across the world, we have not been doing very well collectively as member states of the UN, and therefore there's need for action to be taken to ensure that we accelerate our progress towards 2030. Otherwise, we'll not achieve them come 2030.
Let's talk about some of those goals in which we are behind. What are some of those key initiatives where we should be ideally much further along to get to achieve them by 2030?
Well, so for instance, one of the things that's very clear here is issues around climate change. The Caribbean being what it is, in Jamaica being part of the Caribbean region, there's a bit more we need to do around climate change. When we look at the fact that the vulnerabilities exist, we need to put in place measures that will ensure that we are prepared And when indeed, if disasters strike, according to us, as we've seen in certain parts of the world, with climate change taking so we need to be able to reconstruct and move forward in that regard. Jamaica has done fairly well around gender, though there's still quite a lot to be done around gender. And one of the challenges we have in Jamaica is issues around gender-based violence. That is a concern. When you look at education, good progress, but also concerns around children staying in school, and also in some aspects there's issues around child protection, children becoming victims of violence, and as we heard recently of a child, and many others. So, and the thing that I mentioned earlier on around targets. So each when you look at the goal, each goal has several targets, many targets, and therefore we can't look at a goal in isolation. What it is that makes or comprises that goal, and that's what we need to be targeting. How do we improve access to education? How do we improve access to health care? And the challenge, and you talked about some of the goals. We are looking also at the health goal. And I'm delighted to mention here that only a few days ago, Jamaica was certified as being one of those countries in the world that have succeeded in eliminating the transmission of HIV from mother to child, HIV and syphilis. So we are making progress around health, but there's still issues of non-communicable diseases. We need to cut down in the number of cases around diabetes, hypertension, and cases like that.
Challenges in one level, but also opportunities, meaning it allows us to be able to zoning specifically on what needs to be done in the medium term and in the long term as well.
Exactly. Yeah, indeed. And this is what has, because given and recognizing the fact that we're not moving the way that we should be moving, recently UN and the UN here being member states have agreed on what we call the 6 transitions. The 6 transitions are really investing at the entry points, being able to accelerate the rate at which we're moving the Sustainable Development Goals.
Explain that simpler for me.
So simpler for you, I was going to break them down. So one of the transitions we're looking at is digitization. Mm-hmm. Digitization has proven to be an entry point that will basically accelerate everything. So if you're talking about education, the use of digital technology helps us to move across and actually get access to education fairly quickly. There's the issue of energy. How do we ensure that we have access to energy, and given climate change, looking at alternative sources of energy?
Like solar, like wind,
solar, yes, like wind, like rain, and things like that. Then there's the issue of food security. Food security is critical, and you know that the Caribbean region is looking towards reducing food imports by 25% come 2025. And if we can do that, we're then guaranteeing food security. There's jobs, very important.
And that's food security point, before you move on to the jobs, those are also opportunities for farmers as well, because they have a sense of what do I actually need to do. Farming.
Farming is important, and it's not just farming, but also ensuring that it's the right food, all right? So you're talking about nutrition, very important. Then you have issues, one other transition is jobs. We need to get jobs, and this has to be decent jobs. And as I say, decent jobs with rights, jobs that pay well, and jobs that you have access to negotiation. Then tied to the jobs, the other transition is social protection, because we will have, and we do have, not everybody will be able to get a job, that they need something in the short term to be able to rely on until such a time they can get a job. So, and even when you retire, we don't want a situation when you retire, then you become poor, so you fall back into the poverty trap. We need to have social protection systems that are able to take care of those who are in need. Those who we left behind, those who we need to jack up. So that's very important in that regard. But also very important is tied to the job thing is getting appropriate skills. All right. Many times you hear what they call a skills mismatch. We're training young people, but then they can't get jobs.
Yes.
Because they were not training for the job. So we need to know when we're training, how do these young people fit into this job profile? So we need to be listening more to the private sector. So there has to be a dialogue between the training institutions and the private sector, so that the training institutions are training for the private sector. Because as a private sector investor, what you don't want is employ somebody, then you have to retrain them because they're not trained appropriately.
And at the same time, individuals are the ones who make the choices. So if you know what is going to be needed in the future, you can make that choice right now.
Exactly, yeah. But then you need to make an informed choice.
Yes.
And that's about knowing what's there in the market. So those are the so what we're saying that if you invest into these 6 transition or these areas that I've articulated, then hopefully we can get a leap forward. Because at the pace we're going now, 2030 is what, 6-7 years away. We will not achieve the SDGs. We need to come together, invest in these transitions, and see if we can move forward in being able to achieve the 17 goals.
Are there any particular examples of like key projects or initiatives that the UN is working on specifically with Jamaica on some of these goals that we're behind on, or we could sort of accelerate growth on? Oh yeah,
definitely. And just now I'm delighted to say here that just recently we got approval, and we're working very closely with the government here on a project on digital transformation and focus on education. Because the goodness thing with digital, investing in digital, is that in this case, and the Ministry of Education, I know, are very keen on the information management system, knowing how many children come into school, how many children leave, how do we invest in digital infrastructure and networks on curriculum development, so that, for instance, how do you make access of hardware like laptops to kids, internet facility, internet access. So we're just about to start that project, and we're hoping that project will make a difference in the educational sector and supporting the information management system for them able to track. Eleonora talked about tracking, be able to track the progress the education system is doing, but also to ensure that children have access to education irrespective of where they are. That will take a bit of investment. We're also working extensively on supporting and empowering women, not just in different sectors, but specifically in agriculture. How do they become productive, and how do they make a living out of agriculture? Because agriculture really should be a business. But unfortunately, you see that some of us as subsistence farmers find it very difficult because of the methods that they use. So we're investing on training, on how to better grow your crops, how to better market your crops, get access to information on the commodity prices, because we don't want a situation where the rural folk grow foods, then they are undercut by middlemen and women who then sell these at higher prices. The UNDP is working in Jamaica on issues.
United Nations
Development Program, yeah, and the agriculture is being done by Food and Agriculture Organization. Then we have UNDP working on issues of climate adaptation and things like that. Because like I said earlier on, we need to be looking at renewable energy. How do we diversify away from what are called dirty energy into cleaner energy? Invest more into solar, but we need capacities. We need to ensure that we, again, going back to training, we're training young people who can fix solar batteries, who can fix solar panels, who can install these things. Because if we do not have the capacity, then we don't make the progress. So we're doing work around that. We're also working around supporting what we call the just transition from what is called the informal economy to the formal economy. A lot of young people do not find jobs in the formal economy, but then use this as an opportunity. The only option they have is to start their own small business, sit somewhere in the corner, sell jerk chicken and things like that. Yes. But that's not going to take them very far. We talked about sustainable. How do they ensure that they have a sustainable income? So one way of doing that, and the ability to obtain, for instance, a loan will depend on whether they can produce or they're registered for, they've got a TRN or something like that. So you need to support them and also help them in the business skills. How do they articulate the business in such a way that is taken seriously by the bank? Because you can't go to the bank without without a project document, for instance, and get
so. You need to have a serious business,
exactly,
or be perceived to have a serious business.
Yeah, exactly. So supporting them. UNDP, small and medium enterprises, UNDP is trying, ILO, all working towards helping young people transition from informality to formality. There's quite a few other things that we're doing. I know UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, are working on issues of climate change. Because the other thing which is important is education. How do we understand climate change? How do we know that what we're doing is good for the climate? So we have to introduce policy and programs that also make us understand or abide and do the things that are right for us.
I'm hearing a lot of different sort of programs and partnerships there in different UN agencies, but also international agencies overall. And I want to, as we look to close the program, talk a little bit about the role that each of these different sectors of society can do, because as again we're talking about partnerships overall. So first, if you're working in government, if you're working in government as civil servant, etc., what should you be looking to do in order to sort of advance the SDGs?
So government is very important. You know, government is the bureaucracy that makes things happen. And one of the things that we need to look at is being able to implement, because a lot of times we have policies and programs that remain there because we do not have the ability to implement. So I know government has been working towards supporting or capacitation of civil servants to be able to do the work. The civil servants are best placed to know where the priorities of government are, because then they are responsible for ensuring implementation of government policy. So they have a big role to play in this, whether it's a civil servant working at the port, facilitate the importation of goods and services, whether it's a civil servant working in tax collection. You need to collect the taxes to be able, for government to be able to use the money to invest in education and health, whether it's a civil servants working at a medical institution, ensuring that that patient, because we talked about health, right, and accessing health, ensuring that every Jamaican has access to good health. And so they're able to do their bit to ensure that people have access to all these goods and services that will facilitate Jamaica to move towards the 2030 goals. So government is at the heart of it. But I say it again, goal number 17, partnerships, not government alone, government, private sector, civil society, religious organizations, you and I, everybody out there in the street need to really focus on working together to that end.
Let's pick one of those groups that you named right there, the private sector. Someone watching this program, a part of a private sector organization, what should I be doing in order to, again, advance the SDGs, which ultimately benefit my organization and me as an individual as well?
Well, there's a lot the private sector can do and is already doing. I mean, as we say, usually the approach is that private sector is supposed to be the engine of growth. So the private sector investment in job creation is critical. Looking at methodologies of production. So what we're talking about now is ensuring that the private sector invests in green and friendly technologies in the production of goods and services. So by ensuring that they have very green technology in their productive processes, they're contributing already towards the reducing the bad effects of climate change, which ultimately depend on new productive methodologies. The private sector also can be a very strong advocate to each one of us, because the private sector produces the goods and services. So for instance, through marketing campaigns, they can actually educate all of us on the goods and the bads of certain things. But also the private sector in investing in green solar energy, investing in wind energy, investing in climate-friendly agriculture. You know, that's all part of it. Because I know that, for instance, a lot of private sector also have what they call corporate social responsibility programs. But I think private sector companies have moved beyond that. It's not just about corporate social responsibility, but they believe there's a good case in investing in good production, in good technology, but also in education, advocating for the SDGs themselves.
Before I move on to the final group of people I want to talk about, which is just members of the public, you know, people at home as individuals, I want to talk about partnerships overall, because you're talking about a lot of different groups there, and it takes cash to care. So how can they contribute from that kind of perspective as well?
Well, again, as I say, I think in everything that we do in life as individuals, because I say the individual is only but a singular unit of the greater population, the greater community, it's being able, first of all, to be self-aware what our role is. So talk about waste management, for instance. If you go out in the street and throw trash, you're already working against the good of all, because then that plastic container or that trash that you're throwing out there could actually harm the environment. And when we're talking about some of the SDGs that talk about life, I think it's SDG 14 that looks at life underwater. That plastic container will get itself into the sea, and it will harm a fish and things like that. So some of it doesn't really need sort of cash or anything. You don't need that. It's basically taking upon yourself to make a difference in society, right? If you're involved in education, helping out your neighbor's child in teaching them or helping them out with the homework, you're making an individual contribution there. If you're in agriculture, sharing that extra cassava or sweet potato, it's making a difference towards supporting someone's hunger needs. So, and we're all adding, so they're really building blocks. So let's look at ourselves as building blocks to the better good, the whole good, because each one of us have a role to play, and we need to play that role. Peace and security. We need peace and security for things to happen. The work that the police are doing in ensuring that there's safety and peace and security. Someone will say, what is the role of the police in the SDGs? They're playing a role because we need a secure environment for us to be able to work in, to be able to live in, you know. So each one of us, as part of the bigger community or as a building block towards the bigger community, has a lot to do, yeah?
As we go towards 2030, now the role of the UN sort of coordinating this or pushing it at a global level, are you hopeful?
Well, I'm optimistic, maybe, yeah. So I think it's difficult at the moment, and I think one thing I should have mentioned earlier on is that we were making we've had issues with SDGs, but COVID basically, you know, put the spanner in the works. We've had difficulties in recovering on the SDGs post-COVID, but I'm very optimistic that given the identification of what we call the six transition areas, investment in those areas, and really looking at how we can work collectively as partners. 2030 might sound to be too close, but I think we'll do very well. Yeah.
And I think that is a beautiful point on which to end this interview. I want to thank you so much. My guest today, Mr. Dennis Zulu, who is the United Nations Resident Coordinator in many countries in the region. Very busy portfolio: Jamaica, the Bahamas, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, and the Turks and Caicos Islands. And remember as well that you can get information from the UN pages, you can get information from the Planning Institute of Jamaica's website, and both of those agencies' social media pages as well. I'm Archibald Gordon. Thanks for watching Let's Talk Goals. Until next time, take care.